Hi everybody. Today let's talk about rabies with a vet tech. My name is Amber, owner and founder of Atta Boy Animal Care, and I'm also a 13-year veterinary professional, mostly working as a veterinary technician in daytime practice and emergency. So let's talk about rabies. We know our pets get rabies vaccines if we follow what our veterinarian tells us, but do we know much about it? So today I'm going to talk to you about what rabies is, why we need rabies vaccines, and who can transmit rabies, and a little bit more about that. So let's get started. Rabies is a disease that is carried through mammals. Now, only mammal animals can actually carry rabies. The most common animals that we find rabies in is bats, raccoons, cats and dogs can also obviously get it as well. Coyotes, foxes, cows, ferrets, and I think that's the majority. Now, any mammal can technically get rabies, but those are the most common ones, with bats being the number one instigator of the rabies disease transfer. So, in domesticated animals in the state of Florida, our cats, our dogs, cattle, and ferrets are required to get rabies vaccines, I believe, or at least it's recommended. In cats and dogs, and that's definitely required. Now, why is it so required? Now, it's the only vaccine that's actually required by a veterinarian and the state for your pet, cats and dogs, let's talk about those more specifically, to be given. And why is that? Because rabies, when contracted to humans, rabies is transferred through the saliva of an infected animal or person to another person or animal, usually by a bite, but it's the saliva is what carries the rabies disease to that, and it has to get into the blood system, etc. So it's usually contracted through a bite or an open wound, typically a bite. Now, when rabies is contracted, humans can actually, and animals can die from it. Once we've contracted rabies and it starts showing symptoms, it's almost always fatal. There are a few people that have survived rabies, but it's very, very rare to survive rabies. So that is why rabies vaccines are required, because there's no cure for rabies. So with that said, what does rabies do? Rabies does a lot of things to the system. Obviously, the number one thing people know about rabies is that it makes the person or animal completely fearful of water. That's because the rabies disease actually is completely water-phobic of that. So it's scared of water, so it makes the host of itself scared of water as well, and then they get dehydrated, and lots of bad things happen amongst the nervous system completely breaking down because of the rabies vaccine, or the rabies. So with that said, how can we prevent rabies? Rabies vaccines. Simple enough. Now, the only rabies vaccine that is approved and allowed is given by a veterinarian. Now, if you see rabies vaccines in your mom and pop feed store that you can give at home, it is not good. It is not tested, it's not approved, and it is not okay. And it probably will not work. So if you heard a breeder or a friend or a mom and pop down the street that's like, oh, I got my rabies vaccine from the feed store down the street, not allowed, doesn't work. So the only approved rabies vaccines are required to be given by veterinarians. So there's a handful of companies that maybe make rabies vaccines, and some are cat specific and some are for multi-animal species. Some are approved for 1 year and some are approved for 3 years. That means they either last and give a good immunity support for 1 year or give it a good immunity support for 3 years based off of research. Now, for our cats and dogs, depending on your veterinarian, will depend on what kind of vaccine you get. Now, this is always a great question to ask your veterinarian, depending on if you have specific wants and needs from your rabies vaccine. Some veterinarians carry feline-specific rabies vaccines because they've been proven to be more effective and have less secondary side effects in our feline counterparts. They also only last 1 year. Now, the other vaccines do last 1 or 3 years, depending on the brand that your veterinarian carries. Now, who is allowed to have 1 year versus 3-year vaccines? Every pet is required to have their first rabies vaccine to be a 1-year vaccine, usually done around the 14 to 16 weeks old age bracket, if you've had them at that age bracket, or as soon as you get them into your care, and if they don't have a vaccine history, that first vaccine is a 1-year vaccine. The rabies vaccines that they use are killed or inactivated viruses, so your pet cannot get rabies from the vaccine. And then at their year mark after that first vaccine, that next vaccine typically is a 1-year vaccine. Depending on the veterinarian, depends on that, because the state allows the veterinarian to choose what their protocol is for rabies vaccines 1 year versus 3 years. Some veterinarians say you have to have 3 1-year vaccines in a row before your pet can qualify for a 3-year vaccine if they offer the 3-year vaccine. Some say after 2 doses, some say after that first dose, that 1-year anniversary, they'll gladly offer a 3-year vaccine. Again, it depends on the veterinarian. Now, what's the positive and what's the negative of a 1-year versus 3-year vaccine? Personal preference. Every veterinarian has opinion on that on their own, so I'm not going to get into that. Personally, we have our pets personally go through 3 1-year vaccines and then opt to get 3-year vaccines after that for our dogs. If I had a cat, I would choose to use the feline specific rabies vaccine since it has less secondary side effects. Now, side effects, when I talk about side effects with vaccines, what does that mean? Typically, the most common ones with rabies vaccine are soreness at the site, a fever potentially that will eventually go away, typically, or an allergic reaction. Some pets can have more severe reactions, such as carcinogenic or cancerous sites, but not as common and very rare. Working in the veterinary field for 13 years, I've only seen less than a handful of pets that actually have had major reactions to vaccines, and it's very, very uncommon. Especially if they've had the vaccine before. If it's a first time with the vaccine, especially when they're younger, we always recommend observing the pet a little bit longer to observe any potential side effects. Now, just because your pet gets a little soreness or a fever or a mild allergic reaction does not mean they should not have the vaccine in the future. That just means there's protocols and procedures in place that your veterinarian will do to make sure they have decreased side effects in the future. In the state of Florida, it is required for your pet to have a rabies vaccine, unless your veterinarian writes a letter of exemption to the state veterinary board and it gets approved. Not many veterinarians will do that because it's a safety risk for humans. So unless it's a major medical situation where your pet is going through a major medical issue outside of the rabies vaccine and the rabies vaccine is just not good for them in that moment, or they have a severe reaction to it. Again, I've only seen a handful of letters of exemption in my 13 years of working in a veterinary field. So it can happen, but it's very uncommon. The other alternative is a titer test. A titer test is a blood test. Now, a blood test, a titer test, does not replace a vaccine, and it's not approved in the state of Florida and most other states in the United States as an alternative to the rabies vaccine. What is a titer test? A titer test is a blood test to see where the immunity of that specific vaccine may be in the pet, but there's a lot of outlying factors that can also affect the immunity of a pet regarding anything, but especially if we're talking about rabies vaccine. So a titer test can say if your pet does have a decent immune response to a specific disease, but it's not allowed in the state of Florida as an alternative, except, again, talking to your own personal veterinarian. So, not a veterinarian, talk to your veterinarian. Now, in the state of Florida, since it is required by the state of Florida to have a rabies vaccine, obviously most pet sitters and dog walkers will require your pet to also have a rabies vaccine because it is for safety of the owners, safety of the pet, and safety of the humans. Now, once you get a rabies vaccine for your pet, you need to get, in the state of Polk County, a county license, a pet license, a rabies license, there's a ton of names for them, but ultimately you are registering your rabies vaccine and your pet to the county. So they know you have a pet and they know that you have a rabies vaccine for your pet. Excuse me. Now, those tags that you may see as rabies tags, whatever you want to call them, go on the collar. They have a variety of colors depending on what county you're from. It's a county-to-county specific thing. So if you've moved from another state or you've moved from another county, you do need to change that over with the local county that you live in. In the state of, or in Polk County, you have options of 1-year tags or 3-year tags, again, depending on if you had a 1-year vaccine or a 3-year vaccine. The price of those tags change depending on if your pet is spayed or neutered, or not spayed or neutered, or fixed or not fixed, whatever you want to call it. The price is cheaper if your pet is spayed or neutered. Why? Because your pet probably won't have more pets and they like that. So with that said, you have to go to Polk County Animal Services, which is under the sheriff's office. It is in Winter Haven, to get registered for your pet, or they have a phone, a mail-in process that you mail in the rabies certificate that the veterinarian provides you and some information, and then you can renew that based off of the 1-year or 3-year dependency for each pet. Now, if you have any questions about rabies, always contact your veterinarian, but that's a little bit of information about why rabies vaccines are required in our dogs and cats especially, and ferrets and cattle, etc., because it is transmittable to humans and it is fatal. Now, there is no test to check if your pet has rabies unless they, this is a hard one, if your pet is already passed away or gets euthanized, because the rabies test has to test brain tissue, and the way the brain tissue test occurs is the pet's head is removed and sent to a laboratory facility for testing. So there is no way to test your pet for rabies without their pet already being deceased. So if your pet does get exposed to rabies potentially, say for example, your pet potentially got bitten by a raccoon or got bitten by a bat that may have shown some symptoms, there is a quarantine process depending on how long the pet's had a vaccine in place or doesn't have a rabies vaccine at all, depends on how long that quarantine is. So we definitely want to make sure rabies vaccines are fairly low cost. They're available at any veterinarian or low cost, facility that offers rabies vaccines from a licensed veterinary professional. And that is the number one thing we recommend as a vaccine option for your pet. If you have any questions about rabies, feel free to comment down below. If you have any other questions that you may want to ask a vet tech, myself, feel free to comment those down below. We'll also be talking about other vaccines in the future, such as our Bordetella or kennel cough vaccine and our DHPP or distemper, hepatitis, parvo, parainfluenza, and there's a little extra one called lepto as well. So if you have any questions about those, comment them down below. But remember, rabies vaccine is required in the state of Florida. A titer is an option, but it is not a replacement. An exemption letter from a veterinarian is an option, but rarely had out because it is a danger to our society, because humans do pass away from rabies. There is no cure for rabies for humans or animals, and we would hate to put anyone in that position that may have happened. Have a great day, guys, and remember, happy pets, happy people. Bye-bye.